The sky above the alien city burned a fiery red, the air thick with smoke, and the sound of distant explosions. Corporal Daniel Hayes crouched behind a crumbled wall, scanning the streets through his visor. His mission was clear: evacuate any survivors and avoid unnecessary engagement. Yet, as he moved through the rubble, the horrors of war surrounded him. Dead silence in one corner, screams in another. It was a place where hope seemed lost. Daniel's earpiece crackled. "Hayes, regroup at the checkpoint," came the voice of his commanding officer. "Copy that," Daniel replied, but his gut told him otherwise. Something felt off, like he was being pulled toward the heart of the destruction. As he advanced carefully, he heard a faint sound. Soft cries, almost drowned out by the distant rumble of collapsing buildings. Following the noise, Daniel found himself in front of a shattered structure. The cries grew louder. Without hesitation, he slipped inside. The room was dark, lit only by the flicker of flames from the broken windows. There, huddled in a corner, was an alien woman clutching a small child. Both looked terrified, their alien features sharp yet fragile. The woman's skin shimmered faintly under the firelight, a deep blue hue marred by cuts and bruises. The child, no older than 5 by human standards, clung to her with wide, tear-filled eyes. Daniel lowered his weapon, showing his empty hand. "It's okay," he said gently, his voice muffled by his helmet. He knelt to their level, trying not to appear threatening. "I'm here to help." The woman flinched, her eyes narrowing. She held her child closer, her other hand gripping a makeshift weapon. A shard of metal she must have picked up in desperation. Daniel removed his helmet, revealing his face. "See, no harm," he said, his voice now clearer. The child whispered something in her native language, and the woman hesitated. Her eyes scanned Daniel's face, searching for any sign of deceit. Slowly, she lowered the shard, but didn't let go of it entirely. "Good," Daniel said, exhaling in relief. He extended a hand. "Can you walk? We need to get out of here." The woman looked at him uncertainly, then at her child. She muttered something in a language Daniel didn't understand, but her tone suggested a question. "I don't know what you're saying," he admitted with a small smile, "but trust me, staying here isn't safe." Just then, the ground shook as another explosion rocked the area. The child screamed, and Daniel instinctively moved to shield them both from falling debris. "We don't have time," he urged. Realizing they had no choice, the woman nodded. She tried to stand but stumbled, her injuries too severe. Daniel didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in one arm and lifted the child with the other, his training and adrenaline pushing him forward. The trio moved quickly through the ruined streets. Daniel's earpiece buzzed again. "Hayes, where are you?" "The AVAC point is hot, and we're pulling out in 5 minutes." "On my way," he snapped, frustration creeping into his voice. As they ran, enemy drones buzzed overhead, scanning for survivors. Daniel ducked into an alley, pressing the woman and her child against a wall. The drones passed, oblivious to their presence. "Almost there," he whispered, more to himself than to them. When they finally reached the extraction zone, the sight was chaos. Soldiers were defending the perimeter against an onslaught of enemy forces. A dropship hovered above, its ramp lowered for evacuees. Daniel waved toward the ramp, signaling for help. A medic rushed over, taking the woman and child from him. "They're injured but alive," Daniel said breathlessly. The medic nodded. "We'll take care of them. Get back in the fight." But as Daniel turned to rejoin his squad, a small hand grabbed his arm. He looked down to see the child staring at him, tears streaming down her face. She spoke a single word in her language, one he didn't understand but felt deeply in his heart. "You're safe now," he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her head before rushing back into the fray. As Daniel dove into the chaos, he couldn't shake the image of the woman and her child. In a world filled with destruction, they were a reminder of what he was fighting for. The hum of the dropship's engines grew distant as it ascended into the smoky skies, leaving Corporal Daniel Hayes back on the ground, rifle in hand. His team had regrouped, their mission now focused on holding the defensive line until reinforcements arrived. But Daniel's mind kept drifting to the alien woman and her child. He couldn't forget the way they had clung to life, nor the quiet desperation in their eyes. "Hayes, stay sharp," barked Sergeant Miller, his grizzled face streaked with soot. "This isn't over yet." "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, shaking off his thoughts. The battle raged on. Enemy forces, relentless and methodical, pushed against the human defenses. But Daniel fought with a renewed purpose, each shot from his rifle aimed with precision. He wasn't just fighting for his survival, he was fighting for theirs. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the battlefield fell eerily silent. The enemy had retreated for now, and the human forces began fortifying their position. Exhausted but alive, Daniel sat against a makeshift barricade, wiping grime from his face. "Good work out there, Hayes," Miller said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll need that energy tomorrow." Daniel nodded but didn't reply. His thoughts wandered back to the evac point. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling of unfinished business. The next morning, as the camp stirred to life, Daniel approached the communications tent. "Permission to check on the evacuees from yesterday," he said to the officer on duty. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You're worried about them. They were hurt. I need to know they're okay." After a moment's hesitation, the officer nodded and transmitted Daniel's request. Within minutes, a reply came from the medical facility where the evacuees had been taken. "They're stable," the officer informed him. "The mother has some injuries, but nothing life-threatening. The kid's fine, just shaken." Relief washed over Daniel, but it wasn't enough. "Can I visit them?" The officer frowned. "That's not standard protocol. You've got duties here." "I know," Daniel said, determination hardening his voice. "But I need to see them." By afternoon, Daniel had secured a brief leave to visit the medical facility. A transport vehicle carried him across the desolate landscape to a secure outpost. The facility, a stark white building surrounded by armed guards, was a stark contrast to the ruins he had left behind. Inside, Daniel was directed to a small room. As he entered, he saw Lyra sitting on a bed, her arm bandaged and her eyes still weary. Miri sat beside her, playing with a small, unfamiliar device that glowed softly in her hands. Lyra looked up, surprise flashing across her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel broke the silence. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Lyra tilted her head, clearly struggling to understand his words. Miri, however, lit up at the sight of him. She hopped off the bed and ran to Daniel, wrapping her small arms around his leg. "Guess she remembers me," Daniel said with a soft chuckle. Lyra smiled faintly and spoke in her language. Her tone was gentle, filled with gratitude, though the words were lost on him. She gestured to the bed, inviting him to sit. Daniel hesitated but eventually sat down. He pulled out a small ration bar from his pocket and offered it to Miri, who accepted it eagerly. Lyra watched the interaction closely, her expression softening. Through a series of gestures and broken attempts at communication, Daniel learned more about their plight. Lyra had been a teacher on her planet, forced to flee with her daughter when their city was attacked. Her people had abandoned them, leaving her and Miri to fend for themselves in the ruins. Daniel's jaw tightened. "No one deserves that," he said, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. But the way Lyra's eyes met his told him she understood his meaning. As the hours passed, Daniel felt an unexpected connection forming. Miri clung to him, laughing softly at his attempts to mimic her language. Lyra, though quiet, watched him with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. When it was time to leave, Miri grabbed his hand, refusing to let go. Lyra gently pried her daughter's fingers away, whispering something soothing. "I'll be back," Daniel promised, even though he wasn't sure how he'd keep that promise. As he walked away, he couldn't help but glance back at the small family he had saved. In their eyes, He saw something he hadn't seen in years, a glimmer of hope. Daniel couldn't focus as he rejoined his unit at the forward base. The battlefield's chaos had always been a constant in his life, but now something had shifted. His thoughts were consumed by Lyra and Miri, the alien mother and daughter he had saved. Their fragile smiles and the faint hope in their eyes lingered in his mind like an unspoken promise. "Hayes, you're zoning out again," Sergeant Miller said, snapping him back to reality. "If you can't keep your head in the game, you're going to get yourself killed." "I'm fine," Daniel replied, shaking off the comment. But he wasn't fine, not completely. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Daniel sat by the flickering light of a portable heater, staring at the stars. He thought about the stories his grandmother used to tell him when he was a kid, about how every life had value, no matter how different it seemed. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're thinking too hard again." Daniel looked up to see Private Rodriguez, his closest friend in the unit, sitting down beside him. "You don't get paid extra for deep thoughts, you know," Rodriguez joked. "Just thinking about the evacuees," Daniel said, not meeting his friend's eyes. "The ones you pulled out of that mess yesterday?" Rodriguez asked. "You're a Dan hero for that, but don't let it eat at you. We've got enough problems to deal with without carrying the whole galaxy on our shoulders." "I know," Daniel said, though the weight in his chest didn't lighten. The following morning, orders came through. The unit would be advancing deeper into contested territory. As the soldiers prepped for the mission, Daniel's mind raced. The facility where Lyra and Miri were staying was in the path of the enemy's latest push. He couldn't leave them there, not after what they'd already been through. "Sergeant Miller," Daniel said, approaching his commanding officer, requesting permission to recon the area ahead of the main advance. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Intel says it's relatively clear." I have a bad feeling about it," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. Miller studied him for a moment before nodding. "Fine. Take Rodriguez and don't do anything stupid." Daniel and Rodriguez moved ahead of the unit, navigating through the wreckage of the city. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant sound of gunfire echoed like a warning. As they approached the outpost where the evacuees were, Daniel's stomach tightened. The outpost was eerily quiet. No guards at the gate, no signs of movement. Daniel raised a fist, signaling Rodriguez to stop. "Something's wrong," he whispered. The two soldiers crept forward, their weapons at the ready. Inside, the outpost was in ruins. Medical equipment lay scattered, and scorch marks lined the walls. "They were attacked," Rodriguez muttered. Daniel's heart pounded. "We need to find survivors." As they searched the outpost, Daniel heard a faint sound, a muffled cry. He followed it to a small storage room. Inside, Lyra and Miri were huddled together, trembling. Lyra's eyes widened when she saw him, and Miri ran to him, clutching his leg. "You're okay," Daniel breathed, relief flooding through him. Rodriguez stood guard as Daniel quickly assessed their condition. Lyra had a deep cut on her arm, hastily bandaged, and Miri's cheeks were streaked with tears. Lyra spoke rapidly in her language, her voice tinged with desperation. "I don't understand you," Daniel said, shaking his head, "but I'll get you out of here." As they exited the storage room, the sound of enemy drones grew louder. "We've got incoming," Rodriguez shouted. "Stay close," Daniel told Lyra and Miri, his voice firm but calm. The group moved quickly, avoiding the open areas. Daniel led them through the ruins, his mind racing. He needed to get them back to safety, but the path was crawling with enemy patrols. "Hayes, we're not going to make it like this," Rodriguez warned. Daniel scanned the area and spotted an abandoned vehicle nearby. "That's our way out," he said. With quick coordination, the group reached the vehicle. Daniel helped Lyra and Miri inside while Rodriguez started the engine. The vehicle roared to life, and they sped away, dodging enemy fire. As they raced toward safety, Daniel glanced back at Lyra and Miri. The fear in their eyes had eased, replaced by a flicker of trust. "We're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to them. For the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. The tension in the vehicle was thick as Daniel drove through the destroyed streets, Rodriguez keeping a sharp eye out for enemy patrols. Lyra held Miri close, her glowing eyes darting around, the fear of being discovered still evident in her trembling hands. "Almost there," Daniel muttered, his focus fixed on the path ahead. The safe zone wasn't far, but the risk of ambushes loomed large. The ruined city offered too many hiding spots for enemy drones and soldiers. Rodriguez's fingers stayed on the trigger of his rifle, ready to respond to any sudden threat. As they approached a narrow alley, the sound of engines rumbled behind them. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and cursed under his breath. "They'd spotted us," he said. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "Keep driving. I'll handle this." A drone swooped into view, its sleek metallic frame glinting in the dim light. Before it could fire, Rodriguez leaned out of the vehicle and unleashed a volley of bullets. Sparks flew as the drone spiraled out of control, crashing into the rubble. "That's one," Rodriguez said, grinning. But more drones were closing in. Daniel pushed the vehicle to its limit, weaving through the debris-strewn streets. Lyra's grip on Miri tightened, and the little girl buried her face in her mother's chest, trembling. "Hang on," Daniel called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. They reached a collapsed section of the road, too unstable to drive over. Daniel slammed the brakes. "We're going on foot," he said, jumping out and helping Lyra and Miri out of the vehicle. Rodriguez covered their rear as they moved quickly through the ruins. The sound of drones grew louder, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. "Daniel," Lyra called, her voice breaking through the language barrier with urgency. She pointed to a narrow tunnel hidden beneath the rubble. Daniel nodded, trusting her instincts. "Let's go." The group squeezed into the tunnel just as the first drone appeared overhead. It hovered for a moment before flying past, its sensors unable to detect them in the narrow space. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp and filled with the smell of decay. Lyra led the way, her movements quick but cautious. Daniel carried Miri, who clung to him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "It's okay, Miri," he whispered. "We're safe for now." Rodriguez followed close behind, his rifle at the ready. "I don't like being trapped in here," he muttered. "It's better than being out there," Daniel replied. The tunnel led to an abandoned underground shelter, dimly lit by emergency lights. Lyra seemed to recognize it, her tense shoulders relaxing slightly. This must have been a civilian hideout, Daniel guessed, looking around at the scattered supplies and makeshift bedding. Lyra found a small medical kit and began tending to her wounded arm. Daniel set Miri down, watching as the little girl hesitantly explored the space. "She's braver than she looks," Rodriguez said, his tone softening. "She's been through more than most," Daniel replied, his voice heavy with emotion. While Lyra cleaned her wound, Daniel searched the shelter for anything useful. He found a few rations and a map, which he spread out on a dusty table. "This might help us plan our next move," he said. Rodriguez pointed at a marked area. "Looks like a supply drop zone. If we can get there, we might find transport or reinforcements." "It's risky," Daniel said, glancing at Lyra and Miri, "but we don't have many options." As they prepared to rest for the night, Lyra approached Daniel. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression full of gratitude. Though she couldn't speak his language, her eyes said everything. "You're welcome," Daniel said, offering a small smile. Miri tugged at Daniel's sleeve, holding up a small drawing she'd made on a piece of scrap paper. It was crude but clear, a picture of their group, with Daniel standing protectively over her and Lyra. Daniel's chest tightened. He knelt down to her level, gently ruffling her hair. "You're a great artist, Miri," he said. Lyra watched the interaction with a soft expression, her usual wariness replaced by something warmer. As the group settled in for the night, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something worth protecting. The underground shelter was eerily quiet as Daniel woke up to the faint sound of dripping water. He glanced at the others. Rodriguez was leaning against the wall, his rifle across his lap, keeping watch. Lyara and Miri were huddled together, asleep on the makeshift bedding. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to take in the calmness. It had been a long time since he felt anything close to peace, but he knew it wouldn't last. The enemy wouldn't stop searching, and they had limited time before supplies ran out. "Morning," Rodriguez said, his voice low. "Hope you're ready for another day in paradise." Daniel smirked. "Always." Lyara stirred as Daniel prepared the map. She watched him intently, her sharp eyes observing every move. Miri clung to her side, rubbing her eyes. "We need to make it to the supply drop zone," Daniel explained, pointing at the map. He wasn't sure how much Lyara understood, but he made an effort to speak slowly and clearly. She nodded, her face serious. Miri tugged on Daniel's sleeve again, holding up another drawing. This one showed their group at what appeared to be a safe place, surrounded by stars and trees. Daniel knelt down to her level. "We're going to get there, Miri. I promise." The group packed what little they could carry and prepared to leave the shelter. Lyra insisted on walking despite her injury. Daniel admired her resilience. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was determined to protect her daughter, no matter the cost. As they moved through the tunnel, Rodriguez led the way, his weapon at the ready. The exit led to an overgrown section of the city, where nature had begun reclaiming the ruins. It was eerily beautiful, vines crawling over the crumbled buildings. Daniel kept Miri close, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Lyra stayed close behind, her senses sharp. The group moved cautiously, avoiding open areas where drones might spot them. They came across a fallen building that had created a natural bridge over a flooded street. "We cross here," Daniel said, testing the structure's stability. Rodriguez went first, his steps careful but quick. Lyra followed, holding Miri's hand tightly. When it was Daniel's turn, the sound of engines roared in the distance. "Move," Rodriguez shouted, waving them forward. Drones appeared, their searchlights slicing through the rubble. Daniel grabbed Miri, urging Lyra to run. The group sprinted across the bridge as the drones fired, their shots hitting the crumbling structure. They found cover in the remains of a nearby marketplace. Daniel set Miri down, her small body trembling as she clung to him. Lyra crouched beside them, her breathing heavy but steady. Rodriguez peered through a crack in the wall. "They're searching the area. We need to stay quiet." Daniel nodded, his mind racing. He had to think of a way to get them out safely. Lyra gestured toward the back of the building, where a narrow passage led away from the market. "Good idea," Daniel whispered. "We'll take it." The group moved slowly, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the rubble. The passage led to an old storage area, filled with crates and rusted machinery. As they rested, Lyra found a small medallion among the debris. She held it up, showing Daniel. It was an old insignia, likely from a long-gone resistance group. Daniel examined it. "Looks like this place was used during the first invasion," he said. "Might explain why it's still standing." Miri wandered over to a crate and pointed at something inside. Daniel opened it, revealing a stash of preserved food and medical supplies. "Well, this is a lucky break," Rodriguez said, grinning. Lyra's expression softened as she watched Daniel share some food with Miri. She hadn't fully trusted him when they first met, but now she saw him as more than just a soldier. He was someone who cared, someone willing to fight for them. As night fell, the group took turns keeping watch. Lyra sat beside Daniel, her usually guarded demeanor replaced with quiet gratitude. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her glowing eyes meeting his. Daniel smiled. "We're going to make it, Lyra. All of us." She didn't need to speak to convey her thanks. The bond between them was growing stronger, built on trust and shared survival. For the first time, Daniel felt a sense of hope. They weren't just running anymore. They were building something together, something worth fighting for. The air was tense as the group made their way through the storage area. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. The crunch of boots on debris, the occasional creak of old metal. Liara held Miri close, her sharp eyes darting around the shadows. Daniel led the way, his rifle ready. "We've got to find a way to the drop zone before those drones pick up our trail again," Daniel said, glancing at Rodriguez. Rodriguez nodded. "If they do, we're sitting ducks." Miri, walking beside her mother, kept close to Daniel, her small hand brushing against his. She didn't speak much, but her presence was a quiet reassurance to them all. The passage led to an old industrial district, long abandoned but filled with potential hiding spots. The group stuck to the shadows, weaving through rusted machinery and crumbling walls. Daniel stopped suddenly, raising his hand for silence. He crouched, scanning the area ahead. There was movement, small but distinct. "Stay here," he whispered. Before Lara could object, Daniel crept forward, his weapon ready. He peered around a corner and froze. A wounded alien, its body covered in strange armor, was slumped against a wall. It wasn't one of the enemy drones, but a living being, gasping for breath. Daniel waved Rodriguez over. "Check this out. Friendly or foe?" Liara joined them, her expression tense. She recognized the markings on the alien's armor. It was a scout from a neutral faction, one known for staying out of conflicts. "They're not with the invaders," Liara said softly. Daniel approached cautiously, his weapon lowered. The alien opened its eyes weakly, clearly surprised to see humans. The scout spoke in a rasping voice, its language unfamiliar. Liara knelt beside it, speaking quickly in a dialect Daniel couldn't understand. She turned to him after a moment. "He says the invaders ambushed his group. He's the only one left," she explained. "He's been trying to warn anyone he could find." "Warn about what?" Daniel asked. Liara's expression darkened. "A new wave of attacks. Bigger, deadlier. They're targeting civilians." Rodriguez swore under his breath. "Great, just what we need." The scout handed Liara a small device, a glowing orb-like gadget. She examined it, and then handed it to Daniel. "It's a map of safe zones and enemy positions," she said. "It could help us." The group decided to help the scout, carrying him to a safer spot within the industrial district. Daniel used some of the supplies they had found earlier to treat the alien's wounds as best as he could. Miri watched quietly, her eyes wide with curiosity. At one point, she stepped forward and handed the alien a piece of bread. The scout accepted it with a grateful nod, clearly touched by the gesture. "She's brave," Rodriguez said, watching Miri. "She's been through too much to be scared of small things," Daniel replied, his voice soft. As night fell, the group set up a small camp. The scout, still too weak to move on his own, rested while Lara kept watch. Daniel and Rodriguez studied the map the alien had given them. "This route could get us to the drop zone faster," Daniel said, tracing a path with his finger. "But it's risky, lots of open ground." Rodriguez frowned. "Do we have a choice?" "No," Daniel admitted, "but we'll need to move carefully. If we're spotted, it's over." Liara joined them, her expression thoughtful. "I can distract any drones if needed," she offered. "No way," Daniel said firmly. "We stick together. We're stronger that way." Miri curled up next to Daniel as they prepared to rest. She seemed to trust him completely now, her small frame leaning against his side. Liara watched the two of them, her heart heavy yet full. She hadn't expected to find someone like Daniel, a human who cared for her and Miri as if they were his own. "We'll get through this," Daniel said quietly, meeting Liara's gaze. She nodded, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. But as they rested, the distant hum of engines reminded them that the fight was far from over. The early morning light filtered through the gaps in the crumbling industrial walls. Daniel woke with a start, his soldier instincts on high alert. Mary was still asleep, her head resting on his arm, and Liara was already up, her sharp eyes scanning the area. "No movement so far," Liara said softly as Daniel sat up. "Let's hope it stays that way," Daniel replied, his voice low. Rodriguez stirred and joined them, muttering something about the dangers of being too still for too long. The wounded alien scout, though still weak, managed to sit upright, nodding in thanks when Daniel handed him some water. "It's time to move," Daniel said after they all ate a quick meal of rations. "We've got a narrow window to reach the drop zone before the invaders strengthen their patrols." The group moved carefully, using the map from the scout to navigate. The terrain grew more treacherous as they left the industrial district, with open fields dotted by remnants of destroyed vehicles and scattered debris. Mary stayed close to her mother, but her hand occasionally brushed Daniel's, seeking silent reassurance. Daniel offered her a quick smile whenever she looked up, a small gesture of comfort in the harsh environment. Liara noticed the way Mary's trust in Daniel had deepened. Despite everything, it warmed her heart. Daniel was proving to be not just a protector, but someone who genuinely cared. As they approached a narrow pass, the scout suddenly tensed. Liara spoke with him in quick, hushed tones before turning to the group. "He says there's a patrol ahead," Liara informed them. "Drones, heavily armed." Rodriguez cursed under his breath. "We can't take them head-on." Daniel studied the map. "There's an alternate route, but it'll add time, and we'll lose cover at a critical point." "We'll take the patrol," Liara said firmly. "It's the faster option. And we're running out of time." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Mary. "If we do this, we'll need to move fast and precise. Mary stays out of sight, no matter what." Liara nodded. "Agreed." The group set up an ambush, using the terrain to their advantage. Daniel and Rodriguez positioned themselves behind a fallen transport, rifles ready. Liara took a flanking position, her agility and knowledge of the land giving her an edge. Mary stayed hidden in a small alcove with the scout, her eyes wide with fear, but silent as instructed. The patrol arrived, 3 drones, their sleek metallic bodies reflecting the sunlight. Their movements were methodical, scanning the area for any threats. Daniel gave the signal. A well-placed shot from Rodriguez took out the first drone, its core sparking before it collapsed. Liara sprang into action, using her energy blade to disable another drone's legs before finishing it off. The third drone retaliated, its weapon firing bursts of plasma that narrowly missed Daniel. He rolled behind cover, returning fire with precision. His shot hit the drone's core, and it exploded in a flash of blue light. The dust settled, and the group quickly regrouped. Mary ran to Daniel, throwing her small arms around him. "You did so well, staying quiet," Daniel said, patting her head gently. Liara approached, her expression both relieved and proud. "We couldn't have done that without you," she said to Daniel. Rodriguez chuckled. "Teamwork makes the dream work, right?" Despite the humor, everyone knew the danger wasn't over. They moved quickly, aware that the destroyed patrol would likely alert more enemies. By the time they reached the next safe zone, exhaustion was setting in. The scout, still injured, handed Daniel another piece of intel, a series of coordinates that could lead to a hidden resistance base. "This could change everything," Liara said, studying the data. Daniel nodded. "If it's real, we need to reach it. But first, we've got to ensure Miri and the scout are safe." Liara placed a hand on Daniel's arm. "You've already done so much for us. I trust your decisions." The group rested briefly, but the sound of distant engines reminded them of the urgency. They packed up quickly, ready to face whatever came next. For Daniel, it wasn't just about survival anymore. He had made a promise to protect Liara and Miri, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. The resistance base was farther than Daniel had expected. The map provided by the alien scout was detailed, but also marked with hazards, forcing the group to take longer routes. Every hour brought new challenges, unpredictable patrols, rugged terrain, and the increasing tension of being pursued. Miri, despite her small size, kept up remarkably well. Her trust in Daniel was unshakable. Whenever the group stopped, she would cling to him, her presence a small comfort amid the chaos. Lyra noticed this bond growing stronger and felt both gratitude and unease. They reached a forested area by nightfall. The dense trees provided cover, but the group couldn't risk lighting a fire. Daniel took first watch while the others rested, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. Lyra joined him after some time, her expression thoughtful. "She adores you," Lyra said softly, referring to Miri. "She's a strong kid," Daniel replied, his voice low. "She reminds me why I'm doing this." Lyra hesitated before speaking again. "You've given her something she hasn't had in years, hope, and you've done the same for me." Daniel glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. He was about to respond when a faint sound in the distance caught his attention. He motioned for silence, his senses on high alert. A small enemy reconnaissance drone hovered nearby, its blinking lights barely visible through the trees. Daniel gestured to Lyra to stay low as he aimed his rifle. The drone's sensors began to sweep the area, and Daniel took a precise shot, disabling it with a single blast. The drone fell to the ground with a soft thud, but Daniel's instincts told him the danger wasn't over. "They'll send more," he said grimly. "We need to move now." The group packed up quickly, their fatigue pushed aside by the urgency of the situation. Miri clung to Lyra as Daniel and Rodriguez led the way. The next few hours were a blur of movement through uneven terrain. The group avoided open spaces, sticking to the cover of trees and rocky outcroppings. Rodriguez's humor kept the mood from growing too heavy, even as the tension increased. "Remind me to take a vacation after this," he muttered. "Someplace without drones or aliens." "You're stuck with us now," Lyra said, a faint smile on her face despite the circumstances. "Lucky me," Rodriguez replied with a wink. As dawn broke, the group finally reached the edge of the forest. Beyond it lay a sprawling valley, and in the distance, the faint outline of a hidden entrance to the resistance base was visible. "We're close," Daniel said, relief in his voice. But the sound of approaching engines shattered the moment. A convoy of enemy vehicles appeared on the horizon, their speed suggesting they were tracking the group. "We won't make it across the valley in time," Lyra said, her voice tight with worry. Daniel's mind raced. "We need a distraction. Rodriguez, you and the scout take Lyra and Miri to the base. I'll draw them away." "No," Lyra said sharply. "You can't face them alone." "I don't plan to," Daniel replied. "But if I don't, they'll catch us all." Lyra looked torn, but Rodriguez stepped in. "We'll get them there safely, I promise." Miri grabbed Daniel's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "You're coming back, right?" Daniel knelt down, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be right behind you, kiddo. I promise." As the group moved toward the base, Daniel stayed behind, setting up makeshift traps using the limited resources he had. When the enemy vehicles arrived, they were met with explosions and chaos, buying precious time for the others. From a distance, Lyra watched with a heavy heart as Daniel fought with relentless determination. His figure, silhouetted against the rising sun, seemed larger than life. "He'll make it," Rodriguez said, sensing her worry. "He has too," Lyra whispered, clutching Miri close. With the base now in sight, Lyra pushed forward, praying that Daniel's bravery wouldn't cost him everything. The resistance base was a hidden fortress built into the mountainside, its entrances camouflaged by thick layers of rock and dense foliage. As Lyra, Miri, and the others approached, guards emerged from concealed posts, their weapons drawn but quickly lowered upon recognizing the group. "We have injured," Rodriguez called out, helping Lyra, who was limping slightly. A medic immediately took her arm, guiding her toward the infirmary. Mary, however, refused to let go of her mother's hand. Her wide, anxious eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of Daniel. "He'll come, sweetheart," Lyra assured her, but her own heart was heavy with doubt. Inside the base, resistance members gathered, whispering in hushed tones about the newcomers. A commander, a tall woman with a commanding presence, approached Rodriguez. "Did you bring the information?" she asked sharply. Rodriguez nodded, pulling a data chip from his pouch. "It's all here, but we were ambushed. One of our teams stayed behind to cover our escape." The commander's stern expression softened slightly. "We'll send scouts to look for him." Liara interjected, her voice urgent. "He's resourceful. He can handle himself. But please, he won't have much time." The commander nodded. "We'll do everything we can." Meanwhile, Daniel was deep in enemy territory, having lured the convoy far from the valley. Using every ounce of his training, he set traps, created diversions, and outmaneuvered his pursuers. The terrain was unforgiving, but Daniel's determination was unshakable. His primary goal wasn't just survival, it was to ensure Lyra and Miri's safety. Their faces flashed in his mind as he took cover behind a boulder, evading enemy fire. "Just a little longer," he muttered to himself, reloading his weapon. An explosion echoed behind him. A trap he'd set earlier had been triggered, slowing the enemy's advance. Daniel seized the opportunity to slip away, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward the resistance base. Back at the base, Lyra sat with Miri in a quiet corner, trying to keep her daughter calm. The little girl clutched a small blanket, her eyes fixed on the entrance. "Mama," Miri whispered, "what if he doesn't come back?" Lyra's throat tightened, but she forced a reassuring smile. "He will. Daniel is strong and brave. He promised, and he never breaks his promises." Miri nodded, but tears welled up in her eyes. Lyra pulled her close, stroking her hair and silently praying that her words would prove true. As night fell, the tension in the base grew. Scouts returned with reports of increased enemy activity in the region, but no sign of Daniel. Lyra refused to leave the entrance, her gaze fixed on the darkened horizon. Suddenly, a faint figure appeared in the distance, stumbling but moving with purpose. Lyra's heart leaped as she recognized him. "It's him," she cried, rushing forward despite her injuries. Resistance guards ran to assist, helping Daniel into the base. He was bruised, exhausted, and bleeding from a deep cut on his arm, but his eyes lit up when he saw Lyra and Miri. "You made it," Lyra said, her voice trembling with relief. "Told you I'd be right behind you," Daniel replied with a tired smile. Miri ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "I knew you'd come back," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his armor. Daniel knelt down, hugging her tightly. "I'll always come back for you." As the base settled into a cautious calm, the commander approached Daniel. "Your actions bought us valuable time. You saved lives today." Daniel waved it off, just doing what needed to be done. But Lyra saw through his modesty. She stepped closer, her expression soft. "You did more than that. You gave us hope." Daniel looked at her, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "It's what you and Miri deserve." For the first time in years, Lyra felt a spark of something she thought she'd lost: trust. And as she watched Miri happily chatter to Daniel, she realized he had become more than just a protector to them. He was family. The battle wasn't over, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough.